She was supposed to be grateful. That was the arrangement. A woman without prospects, without family, without a future worth naming. She was supposed to arrive in Wyoming, keep her head down, and be grateful someone had sent for her at all. Josephine Harte had other ideas. It was the spring of 1874 when the westbound train pulled into Laramie, and the woman who stepped off it looked like she'd already survived a war. She was 26 years old, with dark hair pinned back under a gray travel bonnet that had seen better years, a canvas bag over one shoulder, and a doctor's leather satchel hanging from the other. The satchel was the first thing people noticed. The second thing they noticed was that she didn't look around the platform the way newcomers usually did. Uncertain, searching, hoping someone would come claim her. She looked around the way a person does when they're deciding whether a place is worth their time. Edmund Calloway noticed all of this from across the platform, and he did not like any of it. He was 38, broad-shouldered, with a jaw that hadn't softened since the war and eyes that had stopped expecting much from the world sometime around Shiloh. He ran the Broken Stone Ranch 12 miles east of Laramie. 800 acres of high prairie grass, 300 head of cattle, and a two-room house that hadn't had a woman in it since his mother died 6 years prior. He had written to the placement agency in Philadelphia because his foreman had told him he needed help, and his own body had started to agree. He had not written because he wanted a partner. He had written because he needed someone to manage the household so he could manage the land. What the agency had sent him was Josephine Harte, former nurse, daughter of a Philadelphia physician, currently in possession of more opinions than Edmund had been prepared for. "You're Calloway," she said, not a question. "I am." He reached for the canvas bag. She let him take it. She did not let him take the satchel. "The agency said established ranch," she said, climbing up onto the wagon seat without waiting for assistance. "How established?" "Is established enough." "That's not an answer." He climbed up beside her and took the reins. "It'll do." She turned and looked at the mountains to the west, at the flat press of sky, at the single dirt road stretching out toward nothing. Something moved across her face. Not fear, he would realize later. Something closer to calculation. "Well," she said, "we'll see." The first week was a lesson in what nobody had told either of them. Nobody had told Edmund that Josephine knew more about livestock medicine than the man he'd been paying to ride out from town every third month. On her second morning at the Broken Stone, she walked into the barn before breakfast, found his prize bull standing with one leg favoring the ground, and had the animal diagnosed and treated before Edmund had finished his coffee. He came out to find her washing her hands at the pump, the satchel open on a fence post beside her. "Foot rot," she said, "caught early. He'll be fine in a week if you keep it clean." Edmund looked at the bull, looked at her, said nothing and went back inside. Nobody had told Josephine that the nearest neighbor was 4 miles away, that the wind in Wyoming did not stop, not in spring, not in summer, not ever, and that the two ranch hands, a quiet Tejano man named Flores and a boy of 17 called Pete, would look at her like she was a problem they hadn't been asked to solve. She solved herself. By the end of the first week, she had reorganized the kitchen, cataloged every medical supply in her satchel and every tool in the house, established that Pete had a chest infection he'd been ignoring for a month, treated it, and begun keeping a ledger of the ranch's household expenditures, because nobody else had been. Edmund found the ledger on the kitchen table one evening, and stood over it for a long moment. "You went through my accounts," he said. "You left them in a box with no order, and 3 years of receipts mixed in with seed invoices." She didn't look up from the mending she was doing. "You've been overpaying for grain since 1871. "That's not," he stopped. "Start it again. That is not your business." She set down the mending and looked at him directly, the way she'd looked at the platform in Laramie, like she was deciding. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "I was sent here to run your household. I cannot run it blind. If that offends you, write to the agency and tell them it didn't work out. But if you want this place to stop bleeding money on the back end while you work the front, then let me do what I came here to do." And he didn't write to the agency. He also didn't thank her, but he left the ledger where it was. Spring moved toward summer with the particular stubbornness of the high prairie, cold nights holding on past their welcome, mornings that smelled like mud and new grass, and something Edmund had stopped noticing years ago. Josephine noticed it. She noticed everything, the way the light changed over the eastern ridge at dawn, the way Flores always checked the southern fence line twice, on windy days, the way Edmund came in late on Thursdays and ate alone and didn't speak to anyone until the following morning. She didn't ask about the Thursdays, but she started leaving a plate covered on the stove. The gesture was not lost on him. He didn't mention it either. What they had those first months was not warmth. It was a kind of productive truce, the understanding between two people who are too busy surviving to waste energy on unnecessary conflict. They disagreed about most things. How much to spend on winter stores, whether Pete was ready to handle the northern pasture alone, whether the old milk cow had enough good years left, or whether she was eating more than she gave. They argued about all of it, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, like water working at stone. And somewhere in the arguing, they started actually listening. It happened slowly. Edmund noticed it first in August, when they were sitting on opposite sides of the kitchen table, going over the fall cattle figures. And Josephine said something about the water access on the eastern acreage that was so precisely right, so exactly what he'd been unable to articulate to himself for 3 seasons, that he stopped mid-sentence and just looked at her. She looked back. What? Nothing, he said, and went back to the figures. But it wasn't nothing. It was the first crack in something he'd built very carefully over a very long time. The trouble came in September, the way trouble in Wyoming usually came, out of the north and faster than you expected. A man named Gideon Price had been buying up land in the valley for 2 years, not with money exactly, with pressure, with fences moved in the night, with water rights disputed and wells suddenly gone dry. 3 homesteaders had already sold, 2 more were considering it, and Gideon Price had made it quietly known that the broken stone, sitting as it did on the best grazing access in the eastern valley, was next on his list. Edmund had known this was coming. He had, with typical stubbornness, decided to deal with it the way he dealt with most things, alone and by force of will. Josephine found out about Price the way she found out about most things on the ranch, by paying attention when people thought she wasn't. She was in the barn treating a horse's cracked hoof when Flores and Pete came in, talking low, and stopped when they saw her. The stopping told her everything. She waited until Edmund came in that evening, set his dinner plate down, and sat across from him instead of retreating to her side of the house. "Tell me about Gideon Price," she said. Edmund's jaw tightened. "Where did you hear that name?" "It doesn't matter. Tell me," he told her. Not all of it, and not easily. He talked the way men like him always talked about things that scared them, which was around the edges, with long silences in between. But she was patient. She'd spent 3 years nursing wounded men who couldn't say where it hurt, and she'd learned to read the shape of what wasn't being said. By the time he finished, she understood the situation completely. Price had been quietly buying up water rights upstream. If he succeeded in diverting the creek that fed the Broken Stone's southern pasture, the ranch would lose 1/3 of its summer grazing. The cattle operation would contract. The debt Edmund had been quietly carrying since a bad winter 2 years ago would become unmanageable, and Price knew all of it. "He's been waiting for the right moment," Josephine said. "He can wait as long as he likes." "Edmund." She said his name plainly, without softness or edge. "He's not going to wait. He's going to move before winter, when you can't afford to fight him in court and can't afford to lose cattle to a dry pasture at the same time." Edmund looked at his plate. "I know." "Then we have to move first." "We." He said the word like it had surprised him on the way out. She met his eyes. "Yes, we." The plan was Josephine's, which meant it was precise and thorough and accounted for possibilities Edmund wouldn't have considered. She had spent enough time in her father's medical practice, watching him navigate Philadelphia's hospital boards, full of men like Price, men who used legal instruments the way other men used fists, to know how that kind of fight was won. It wasn't won with stubbornness. It was won with evidence, timing, and allies. She spent 2 weeks quietly visiting the other ranchers in the valley, not to argue, not to organize, just to listen. She brought medicines for the Delacroix family's youngest, who'd had a persistent fever. She helped the widow Schaefer with a calving that had gone wrong. She drank bad coffee in 4 different kitchens and asked the kind of questions that didn't sound like questions. By the time she brought what she'd gathered back to Edmund, she had documentation of 4 separate incidents of fence tampering. 2 sworn accounts of Price's men diverting a tributary stream the prior summer, and the name of a land attorney in Cheyenne who had beaten Price on a similar dispute 3 years earlier. Edmund sat with all of it spread across the kitchen table and was quiet for a long time. "You did all of this," he finally said, "in 2 weeks." "People talk to me," she said simply. "You're not easy to talk to." He looked up. She thought for a moment that he was going to argue. Instead, something shifted in his face. Something she hadn't seen there before. Something that looked almost like respect. No, he said, I'm not. They filed with the land office in Cheyenne in early October. The attorney, a thin, sharp-tongued man named Horace Vane, took one look at Josephine's documentation and told Edmund he had a good case. Edmund, with characteristic honesty, told Vane that the documentation was his wife's work. Vane looked at Josephine. Are you a lawyer? No, she said. I'm a nurse. But I know how to keep records, and I know what a pattern looks like. Vane smiled for the first time. Then you know more than half the men I work with. The legal process was slow, and it was not without cost. Price's men cut the south fence in November, and 20 cattle got through before Flores caught it. There was a night in early December when someone shot out the window of the tack room. A warning, not an attack, but close enough that Pete slept in the barn for a week with a rifle across his knees. Through all of it, Josephine did not waver. She fixed the fence alongside Flores. She replaced the tack room window with glass she'd sourced from a supply wagon passing through. She kept the ledger, and she kept the household. And when Edmund came in from the cold with a face like a closed fist, she put coffee in front of him and sat down across from him and made him talk. It was in one of those late-night conversations, the fire low, the wind outside, doing what Wyoming wind always did, that he finally asked her the question he'd been not asking for months. Why did you come out here? His voice was quiet. The agency said you volunteered for a Western placement. There were Eastern positions, closer to Philadelphia. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. My father died, she said, 2 years before I wrote to the agency. After that, there was nothing to stay for. The practice went to his partner. The house was sold for debts I didn't know we had. She paused. I was very good at nursing, and I had nowhere particular to be good at it. The West seemed like a place that needed things. Did it turn out to be what you expected? She looked at him. No, she said. It was harder. She let that sit for a beat. And better, she added. He nodded slowly, as if that answered something he hadn't quite known how to ask. In January, the land office ruled in favor of the broken stone. Price's water diversion was found to be unauthorized. He was required to restore the original creek course and pay a penalty that, while modest, was a public humiliation in a valley where reputation was the only currency that lasted. The other ranchers heard about the ruling before Edmund and Josephine had even ridden back from Cheyenne. By the time they reached the broken stone, Flores had somehow already started a fire in the main hearth big enough to warm the whole house. And Pete had killed a chicken for supper that Edmund was fairly sure he'd been planning to let live indefinitely. That evening, the Delacroix family came, and the widow Schaefer, and 2 of the other homesteaders Josephine had visited in the fall. They came with food and with noise and with a kind of ease that the broken stone's walls hadn't held in a long time. Edmund stood in the middle of it and watched Josephine moving through the room, talking, laughing at something old man Delacroix said, cutting bread, steadying a child who'd gotten too close to the hearth fire. And he had the peculiar, disorienting sensation of seeing his home as something other than a place he endured. She caught him looking. He didn't look away this time. It was 3 weeks later, on a clear February morning, with frost still on the window glass, that he asked her. He asked her badly. He'd been rehearsing it for days, and it came out sideways, half practical, and half something he didn't have a word for. Something about how the house worked better with her in it, and the ledger, and the fact that she'd saved the southern pasture, and how winter was long. He got 3 sentences in and stopped, frustrated with himself in the old familiar way. She waited. I'm not asking because of the ranch, he said finally. I know, she said. I'm asking because I don't want you to leave. She was quiet for a long moment, looking at him the way she'd looked at the platform in Laramie, all those months ago, like she was deciding. But this time the calculation in her face was softer. Or maybe he'd just learned to read her better. You should know, she said, that I will always have opinions about the grain prices. I know. And I will not stop keeping the ledger. I know. And I have already decided that we need a second barn by fall. He almost smiled. It was close enough that she counted it. We'll argue about it, he said. We'll figure it out, she said, together. They married in March, in the Laramie courthouse with Flores and Pete as witnesses, and the widow Schaefer crying quietly in the back row for reasons that were probably more complicated than the occasion strictly required. Josephine kept her medical satchel on the seat beside her during the ceremony because there was a pregnant mare back at the ranch, and she was not, she informed the judge, going to be away longer than absolutely necessary. The judge found this unremarkable. He'd married a lot of frontier people. The second barn went up that September, just as Josephine had planned, larger than Edmund thought they needed, exactly the right size as it turned out, because 2 years later the herd had grown enough to fill it. The Broken Stone expanded its eastern acreage when one of Price's disheartened investors sold at a loss. Flores stayed on for 30 years. Pete eventually had a ranch of his own, 12 miles north, and sent his eldest daughter to be educated by a woman who had never stopped believing that medicine was something everyone in the valley deserved access to, not just those who could ride 3 hours to Laramie. The valley changed. Slowly, the way real things change. Not all at once, not with drama, but in the accumulation of small decisions made by people who had decided to be responsible to one another. Josephine Calloway kept the ledger until she was 61 years old, at which point she passed it to her daughter with detailed written instructions, a list of vendors who could be trusted and several who absolutely could not, and a reminder that knowing your numbers was not bookkeeping. It was power. Edmund lived to see the new century. He was not in the end a man who said much. But on the last night of 1899, sitting by the fire in the house that had grown 3 rooms and a proper front porch since the year Josephine arrived, he told her that the worst decision he'd ever made had been writing to that agency in Philadelphia. She set down her book. "Oh? I should have gone to Philadelphia myself," he said. "Would have saved a season." She picked up her book again, but she was smiling. Outside, Wyoming did what Wyoming always did. The wind came off the ridge cold and steady and indifferent to everything below it, and inside the Broken Stone, the fire held. I keep thinking about that moment on the Laramie platform. Josephine steps off the train, and instead of looking around for someone to tell her what to do, she looks around like she's sizing the place up, like she's deciding. That one detail says everything about why her story ends the way it does, and why Edmund's does too. Because what happened between them wasn't luck. It was cause and effect, playing out slow and steady the way things do when people choose to be a certain kind of person, day after day, whether anyone's watching or not. Josephine could have kept her head down. That was the arrangement. Show up, cook, clean, survive the winter. Nobody would have blamed her for doing the minimum in a place that expected nothing more from her. But she walked into that barn on her second morning, saw an animal in pain, and fixed it. Not because it was her job. Because it needed doing and she could do it. That's what I'd call moral clarity. Knowing what's right and doing it without waiting for permission or applause. It sounds simple, it almost never is. And then there's the intelligence she brought to every problem she touched. The ledger, the grain prices, the documentation she built against Gideon Price. 4 ranches worth of evidence, organized and presented with the precision of someone who understood that fights like that aren't won by being louder or stronger. They're won by being right and being able to prove it. She didn't just react to problems. She understood them. She traced them back to their roots and figured out where to apply pressure. That kind of clear-eyed thinking is its own form of power, and it doesn't require anything but the willingness to pay attention and do the work. But what stays with me most is the endurance. Not dramatic, not loud, just steady. Josephine kept going through the cold and the cut fences and the shot-out windows and Edmund's silences and all the 100 small ways the West pushed back against people who dared to try. She didn't harden. She didn't give up. She kept the fire, kept the ledger, kept showing up. That kind of persistence is the thing most people underestimate, because it doesn't look like heroism from the outside. It just looks like another ordinary day. And Edmund, he gets less credit than he deserves in his own story, I think, because the harder thing for a man like him wasn't fighting Price. It was learning to let someone in. Learning that needing help isn't the same as failing. Learning to say we and mean it. That took its own kind of courage. Quiet, unglamorous, real. What I take from all of it is something I have to remind myself of more than I'd like to admit. The life you build is mostly made of small decisions. Whether to notice the thing that needs doing. Whether to think carefully instead of just reacting. Whether to keep going on the days when keeping going is the hardest thing you've ever done. Josephine didn't change the Broken Stone in one dramatic moment. She changed it one morning at a time. And in the end, the fire held.